The answer to this question is the key to understanding Revelation and all prophecy concerning time after the cross. Believe it or not, Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy not only predicts the arrival of the Messiah Jesus and his death, but it also is the very foundation of the book of Revelation. The two are uniquely tied together so much so that I would argue one cannot be understood correctly outside the context of the other. Likewise, separating the two is equally disastrous. Allow me to start by setting up the context of the 70 weeks prophecy. Chapter 7 parallels with the four beasts seen in Revelation with the opening of the sealed scroll. The first is Christ, the second is Islam, the third is Catholicism. The fourth continues through to the second coming and includes the time frame for the Antichrist being only 3.5 years. That marks the last half of the 70th week, which still needs to be fulfilled. Chapter 8's vision concerns the time of Alexander the Great defeating the Persians. Then the empire being divided into 4 smaller empires. And a description of the temple being destroyed. Daniel asks 2 questions, but only one gets answered at that time. The only answer he is given is that the sanctuary will be cleansed in 2300 days. Far too many experts want to say this refers to years, but the word translated as days is actually 2 separate words, evenings and mornings. This refers to the twice-daily sacrifices made in the temple every day for all the unknown sins. Thus 2,300 evenings and mornings turns into 1,150 days, or about 3.15 years on our calendar. This marks the 3+ years of the ministry of Jesus between his baptism in 27 AD and the cross in 30 AD, marking the last and final acceptable sacrifice. 27 AD will also coincide with the end of the 69th week. In chapter 11, Daniel is told the prophetic history of Israel all the way up to the second coming. It starts around 539 BC as the 70th year of their exile is approaching. The 4th Persian king Darius III will be great in power, but will fall to an even more powerful king from Europe. Alexander the Great sets up the Roman Empire and seizes control over most of the known world at the time. Then the great empire will be divided into 4 kingdoms. The Byzantine Empire rules over the land of Israel. In chapter 11, it starts getting interesting in verse 22 when the Prince of the Covenant is killed. The word used by Daniel for prince is very unique and only applies to the highest prince or ruler of rulers. The word is na-gid, and even though prince is seen many times in the book, only na-gid is used in reference to the Messiah Jesus. The only other time Daniel uses this word is 9:25 and 9:26 when referring to the Messiah Prince of the Covenant Jesus who dies on the cross and the Prince who is to come who will return again. Now again, we can see the parallels with the previous chapters. Verse 22 is the cross and ties to his ministry, and the first half of the 70th week in chapter 8 verse 11. The abomination of desolation and destruction of the temple are seen in verses 29 through 31. It only gets mentioned one time in the entire New Testament in Matthew, which was written before 70 AD because there are no additional occurrences on the prophetic timeline. So, no third temple. The Antichrist is never mentioned until verse 40 in connection with the time of the end and the last head of the beast from chapter 7. His time frame always is just 3.5 years. Chapter 12 picks up with the Archangel Michael protecting the Jews, including the 2 witnesses at the start of the tribulation, which begins back in chapter 11 verse 40, and also connects to Revelation 14. Daniel is then told to seal up the book until the time of the end. Sealing something means to keep it hidden. The new covenant we have with Jesus is what is hidden from the Jews. I believe the book of Revelation is the sealed part of this prophecy. In Revelation, the sealed scroll represents powerful forces or spirits reigning over the earth until Jesus returns. There is another great video on that, so I won't go into it now. But, when the scroll is completely open at the time of the Great Tribulation, then the temporary blindness will be removed. This open or completed scroll is what John is told to eat in Revelation 10. John is then instructed to write another prophecy book, most likely concerning the final 1,000 years. Before getting into the 70 weeks, there is one last section yet to be covered. Chapter 12 verse 7 tells us it will be 3.5 years until the Antichrist is allowed to kill the 2 witnesses. Revelation 11 tells us that the second coming occurs immediately after the 2 witnesses are raised up. Verse 11 is yet another one of those verses that are completely misunderstood and misinterpreted. It uses the same phrases describing the destruction of the Second Temple in 1131. It says after that there will be 1290 days, or another way of saying 3.5 years. Yes, the experts will say there must then be another temple built in order for this to be fulfilled. But, ever notice there is never any mention of another temple or another abomination of desolation in all of Revelation. That is because there won't be one. So, you ask then, how can we understand this verse? Others will point to 2 Thessalonians as proof of a third temple, but you already know that Jesus described himself as the temple of God, and Christians also are described as the temple of God. So, when the Antichrist claims power, he will claim himself to be the heir to the throne in the temple of God in the same way that Jesus did. You see, there is no need for a temple to be present. The context of his fraud will be to convince people that he is Jesus returning to earth to rule over it with a rod of iron and put to death all those who oppose him. So, the 1290 days or 3.5 years mentioned are the remaining time frame given to complete the 70 weeks prophecy. That means there is a gap between the events of the first century and the tribulation right before the second coming. It's not talking about the time frame between the specified times allotted, namely 70 AD and the 3.5-year tribulation. It is simply stating that there still remains more prophetic time before the end. Look at verse 12 and notice there is some additional time of 45 days added to the end of the tribulation. This marks the start of the 1,000 years and also fills in the missing days due to the not quite 3.5 but only 3+ years of ministry leading up to the cross. Now, I hope the 70 weeks prophecy will be a bit easier to comprehend. To set the scene, Daniel is realizing that the 70-year exile prophecy is about to end and he is worried that maybe God has forgotten about his people. The prophecy begins by stating the time frame of 70 weeks, commonly understood to mean 70 times 7 or 490 years. I will have a lot to say about that later. For now, there are also 6 purposes listed to be accomplished by the Jewish people and the city of Jerusalem. So, within those 490 years, those 6 purposes must be accomplished. Right away, we can see how this contradicts all the other interpretations of this prophecy. Amillennialists want to insist it concerns only spiritual things which were all fulfilled in the first century. But, now you see why I spent the time to go over the rest of Daniel's visions. Especially the ones concerning chapters 11 and 12. They suggest large expanses of time between the major events like the cross, 70 AD, and the second coming. The idea of sealing or keeping the prophecy hidden from the Jews, until the time of the end, keeps repeating both here and in the New Testament. Jesus has not returned yet, and the book of Revelation specifies that it is a prophecy book of things that will happen quickly or right away. Amillennialists again will insist that Revelation does not contain prophecy of future events until chapter 19 verse 7, when it speaks of the end of the 1,000 years. Likewise, premillennialists will unknowingly use the flawed and misleading amillennialist translations and arrive at their own conclusions which are equally flawed and erroneous. This view has to use bogus math to arrive at an end of the 69th week at the cross in order to have a full 7-year tribulation. I just showed how Daniel tells us the time between the end of the 69th week and the cross was to be just over 3 years. However, if you arrive at the correct end of the 69th week to be the baptism, then the cross can be part of the 70 weeks, and thus the gap in which Revelation takes over is in the midst of the 70th week. Revelation prophecy focuses primarily on the tribulation period and the second coming. In all instances, the time frame given is the same 3.5 years. Since everything hinges on when the 69th week ends, I made up this chart for you. Most scholars will give 1 to 4 dates as a starting point. I will use all 4 to be fair. The end dates were calculated by using the Hebrew calendar to maintain its integrity and Hebrew context. Without going into all the details here, the only logical one is 27 AD. Now we are already down to verses 25 and 26. Of special note here is the use of the word na-gid as prince which I introduced earlier. Verse 25 uses it to speak of Jesus as the Jewish high priest who dies for the sins of the world, and verse 26 uses it to speak of Jesus as the prince of the Christians or the prince to come. You can go back into chapter 11 as well as the letters to the churches in Revelation and see how the Christians devolved through time and even became the foundation for the eventual Church of Satan, which is in Rome, which are the people who destroyed the temple and the city. Now let's look at the worst interpretation of prophecy imaginable. The word he in verse 27 interpreted as being the Antichrist making a peace deal with Israel. First, the word he is not even in the original text. Second, notice the word and in the front of the sentence. That means the subject never changes. It is still Jesus. Granted, it can be confusing, especially if you listen to the experts. Remember, the previous verses spoke of the first 69 weeks. Now this last verse will address the 70th week in the same context that the rest of Daniel's visions do. Verse 26 mentions that the Messiah is killed after the 69 weeks are concluded. That verse focuses on the temple being destroyed and desolations, which means rendering it useless. Verse 27 has a unique double meaning embedded within it. First is the idea of fulfilling part of the final 7 years with his arrival, ministry, and eventual death on the cross as the symbolic Passover lamb for the sins of the whole world. Thus, the temple sacrifices are deemed useless, and this is the cause given for them to cease. The overspreading or continuation of sacrifices after 30 AD not only leads to the 70 AD destruction, but also deems it as desolate all the way to the very end. The other meaning can be attributed to the Holy Week of 7 days. His arrival on Palm Sunday, his death in the midst of the week. In 30 AD, Passover Sabbath was on Thursday, so the day before was a Wednesday, and of course being resurrected Saturday night after 3 days and 3 nights. Thanks for staying this long, but now you get a special treat. Allow me to focus on the word weeks. If you look at a concordance at the many times the word weeks is used in the Old Testament, it appears to be the exact same word number 7,620 with no exceptions. However, the original Hebrew comes in many different forms. Our word shown here will prove unique in several ways. Hebrew is written and read from right to left. Look at the last letter. It looks like a circle and represents completion of a covenant or promise. In this case, the word denotes a specific time frame for completion. In verses 25 and 26, the first 7 weeks or 49 years mark the completion of city, and the 69th week marked the arrival of the Messiah, thus denoting a completion of prophecy. When Jesus returns, the 70th week will also be completed. Now it's very interesting to look at the other times the word appears the same way. First thing you probably noticed is the last letter is not the completed circle. The symbol looks like the letter N and denotes a covenant. Now consider the other two and their context. Both refer to the Feast of Weeks, which involves 7 weeks. Also, there is no additional word attached denoting 7 as in the phrase 7 weeks. So, the word itself means 7 times 7. The biblical meaning of 7 times 7 has great significance. First, it equates to unlimited forgiveness, as in Matthew 18 verse 22, when Jesus said we should forgive them 70 times 7. It also symbolizes restoration, freedom, social equity, including forgiveness of debts and returning of land. The Feast of Weeks marks a time of spiritual preparation and growth, culminating in rest on the final Sabbath before the Jubilee year. Now look again at our prophecy and notice how a different time frame can be established if we interpret the 70 weeks as 70 times 7 times 7, or 70 times 49, or 490 times 7. Back to the Feast of Weeks again for just a second. Each week of the 7 weeks also have unique spiritual meaning attached to them that will astound you. The first week is associated with completion. Very interesting connection there, with the first week being tied to the first fruits and Resurrection Sunday. In our new timeline, the first week then ends in about 30 AD. Moving on with that analogy, the second week is associated with deliverance. The physical count would put it around 560 AD, counting from 70 AD. You have to remember the Jubilee or 50th year follows after the completion of the 49 years. I believe the extra 40 years after the cross becomes part of this prophecy, and so there would be an extra 70 years added to the 3,430. That means 30 more years will likely need to be added somewhere else. The political scene in 560 AD had the area under Byzantine rule after the Roman Empire divided into 4 smaller empires. So, deliverance from the Roman Empire can be associated here. Week 3 comes around 1050 AD, and it is associated with end of distress. Only thing of note I can think of would be the Catholic Church gaining dominance and beginning the Crusades, starting with Jerusalem. While the Crusades are attached to very negative and evil thoughts, the intent was to free the Holy Land and the world out of the hands of non-believers like Muslims, who were already very powerful and controlling most of the Middle East by that time. The 4th week represents spiritual guidance and clocks in around 1540 AD. Of note at that time was the beginning of translating the Bible into German and English, so that normal people who were starting to become more educated and able to read had access to the Word of God without having to rely solely on what they were being told it says and means. Of course, the Reformation would follow soon after. The fifth week is associated with vindication and clocks in at 2030 AD. Now we can only extrapolate from what we already know, but there is a lot of information and speculation out there about the second coming being attached to 2030. Will that be the year for the rapture or the second coming? We won't know for sure until something happens. The sixth week associates with arrival and comes in around 2520 AD. By then, the earth should be in the middle of the 1,000-year reign after the second coming. The 1,000 years are a promise made to the Jews in the Old Testament and will not include Christians unless they were left behind at the rapture or only became true believers afterwards. Revelation 20 verse 4 specifies that the ones entering the earthly kingdom are only those who rejected the Antichrist and the mark. So, do not confuse this passage as a rapture reference. The final week is attached to rest and times in around 3010 AD. Of course, this will be the end of the 1,000 years, and most likely still need to add another 30 years if not attached to either of the two previous ones. Satan will be loosed from prison and allowed to gather the outer fringes of civilization for one last attempted revolt, otherwise known as the War of Gog and Magog, and the now unwalled and unprotected cities primary of which will be Jerusalem. The white throne, condemnation, judgment will occur on earth. Notice the connection between the white throne judgment and Romans 8 verse 1. The New Jerusalem containing Christian believers will descend from heaven after the condemnation judgments are finished. After that, only God knows. The 70 weeks prophecy must be seen in light of the historic symbolism attached to the Feast of Weeks. Although the first week attached to Passover is symbolized as completed on the cross, there still remains a total of 6 more weeks, as just discussed. The first week culminated at the cross, and the last 2 weeks are the 1,000 years, both of which are associated with the Jews. That leaves the central portion of 4 weeks or 2,000 years covered prophetically by the now partially unsealed scroll, also known as the Book of Revelation, written for Christians. That was a lot of information packed into a 17-minute video. I suggest watching it again and pausing at sections discussing entire chapters and visions. Take notes and read through those sections carefully, then repeat the process to the end of the video. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Especially if there is a section of prophecy you would like me to focus on. Also be sure to look for Free Donkey on eBay. All the information is written in the description section, so there is no need to pay. It's completely free.